Hello everyone, welcome to Liam's Lifetime. I'm your host Liam, aka Hembar, and welcome to a video that I should have made 2 years ago. And this is going to be me talking about the classics of Sword and Sorcery that you might want to read, either someone who's a little bit into the genre, or not used to it at all, like maybe you epic fantasy fans, or has read none. So because I started with the classics kind of myself when I decided to go and read more Sword and Sorcery. So again, I meant to make this video a couple years ago when I made my What is Sword and Sorcery video. So if you want to know what that is, then you can go watch that. I'll try to remember to link that here. But first, I'm just really going to talk about the three big main Sword and Sorcery authors. They're called the Masters of Sword and Sorcery, and then kind of the three secondary masters, I guess, if you would. And then I'm going to have some just general recommendations, even some that I haven't read yet, but that are worth mentioning, I believe. So the first master, of course, is the father of Sword and Sorcery, and that is Robert E. Howard. Now he's most famous for Conan, and this is probably where you should start. There is a big one-volume version, but I don't think that has illustrations in it. These have nice illustrations. There's 3 volumes, and the first one is The Coming of Conan the Cimmerian. These are in publication order, or at least written order. So they kind of go from different periods in Conan's life. So the first one is him as a king. There's other ones of him as as a pirate or as a thief. And Robert E. Howard is credited with creation of Sword and Sorcery because of his, is it 19? It's late and I'm tired. So either 28 or 29 short story of The Shadow Kingdom, which is a Cole story. It was not Conan. There's also Bran Morn and Solomon Kane. But they're very, very energetic. There is a nice energy to Robbie Howard when you read him. They get a little, I mean, they're not the greatest at times, but I feel like they're worth your time. They have some cool Eldritch stuff, and Conan is the standout. He's really what drives the stories, though he doesn't take up 100% of the page time in a lot of them. So I just something you might not be familiar with, especially if you haven't read Sword and Sorcery. These are pre-Tolkien for those unaware as well. So shorter because they're in the pulp, so short stories to novella. There's one novel, which is The Hour of the Dragon, which is in the second volume, actually, if you get this set. So I highly recommend. And then the next big one is Michael Moorcock and his Elric of Melniboné, who's kind of the anti-Conan. Elric is weak. He's got this problem with his blood, so he's going to die, essentially, if he doesn't have this medicine. And it's essentially him being a slave to something all the time, and him being very introspective and thoughtful about his cruddy life and his cruddy people and his cruddy world. It does get a little epic at times, mostly at the very end of the series, but it's kind of tragic at the same time. So Elric is very much a dark character. He's a little bit of a sorcerer himself, and he has this awesome blade for most of the series called Stormbringer, which is like the black sword, right? I mean, like it drinks souls and stuff like that. It's not the original one, but it is the black sword, essentially, right? So there's 7 of these if you get the main. Wow, I say that. I think there's actually 9 now. I didn't say 7. So there's 8. There's 9 now because they had one come out last year. Anyways, you can get the big bind-ups from Saga Press, I think. That does them just in 3 volumes. So, and there's other ones by Moorcock in his Eternal Champion series, which is very much a multiverse type of thing going on. And like Corum, for example, is another one of those that I really enjoy, that I would call Sword and Sorcery as well. The last of the masters of Sword and Sorcery is the man who actually named the genre of Sword and Sorcery, which is Fritz Liber. That is how you say his name. It's not Liber, though it's a common way to say it. That's not how he said it, at least. And Sword and Deviltry is book 1 of 7, though you can find them in bind-ups, generally of 2 volumes, 2 omnibuses. But in these old bind-ups, Swords and Deviltry is the first one, but it wasn't actually the first published, I believe, because these stories were written later. Swords Against Death is actually a good place to start as well, but this one takes place first chronologically. But this is about a duo of rogues. One is Fafhrd, who is a giant from the north. He's a barbarian. And another is the Grey Mouser, who is this short, roguish character from the city. And he also practices some sorcery as well. So they're buffoons. It is like the original fantasy bromance, essentially, right? You wouldn't have really any that you can think of if you didn't have fought for the Great Master. And they're the best one. They're hilarious. They don't always win, but they are the best swordsmen in the world, essentially, right? So, and they spend most of their time in the city of Lankhmar. And I could talk on and on and on. This is probably my favorite of the original three, big three sword and sorcery authors. I'm a huge fan of Liber. Then there's the tertiary three, kind of the secondary three, that I also feel like are worth a recommendation for whatever reasons. Jarell of Jari by C.L. Moore, who is Catherine Lucille Moore. She's probably more famous for her creation of Northwest Smith, who's essentially the proto Han Solo. And there's sci-fi stories, but Jarell of Jari is sword and sorcery, and they take place in like a medieval France type of setting. My book never had a cover when this is just how I bought it, by the way, but this is all of them too, so it's pretty short. There's not a lot to read here. The most famous story is Black God's Kiss, which is the first one. That's not my favorite, but they're all pretty good, right? And they have a very dark feel to them. I feel like there's definitely some differences here between something like Robert E. Howard, which was contemporary with Jarell, and you see a lot. The main character is a woman, actually, which is something that was very early on in Sword and Sorcery. You had a main character as a woman, and a really good one. And she is a leader of her people, and she solves a lot of her problems without the sword, actually. So it's pretty interesting. Some dark stories in here that I think you'd enjoy. I did a review of that bind up a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago. But the next of the secondary group is Charles Saunders, or Charles R. Saunders, I think is how you can find his work sometimes. But Imaro, or Imaro, I think it's Imaro. And this is actually the first in a series, but it's kind of hard to get a hold of the rest, essentially. And so Imaro is one, he's just really good. He's kind of more of a Conan type, or he's been described as Tarzan, actually Black Tarzan, right? But he's kind of Blood and Thunder. He's got an outsider, so you build his character from the beginning more than you get Conan's, essentially. And it's African-inspired fantasy. This essentially, Charles Saunders is the father of Sword and Soul, which is a subgenre of the subgenre of Sword and Sorcery, which focuses or takes a world built on African history and myth and stuff like that, rather than European stuff, which is what you get a lot of your Western fantasy is based off of. And so, if you haven't read that or haven't read Imaro, I highly recommend it. It's really good. It's very gripping. Good luck finding it. I feel like this first volume is probably a little easier to get than the rest of them, but still highly enjoyable. This does have an audiobook version as well, I think so. And then the third and final of those tertiary to secondary sword and sorcery authors is Karl Edward Wagner, who's also a horror writer. And Kane is his main character, or as it says on the back of the book here. You can also read him in like Death Angel Shadow or Dark Crusade and some other books. But Kane is I kind of see him as a go-between of like Conan and the more just strictly heroic fantasy, because Sword and Sorcery is essentially heroic fantasy, but a little bit more specific in like style and taste. So kind of a go-between Conan and Gemmel, like Druss and Gemmel. But Kane is also a bad guy, essentially. He's essentially the antagonist, and so you don't know what bloody thing he's going to come up with, essentially, right? He's immortal and he's immoral, right? So very fun stories that are they kind of channel Robert E. Howard, but they're very unique at the same time. So recommend Kane. This is also a little hard to get a hold of the stories of Kane. So those are the big six, essentially. Now I'm going to get into more secondary authors, which are all very good authors still, so you should check them out. But the first one is The Broken Sword by Paul Anderson. This is a tragic tale. This inspired Elric. There's a black sword in here, actually, hence the name of the book. It's also historical fantasy. It takes place, I believe, in either the 8th or 9th century. It's been a minute since I've read this, so but it also has like elves and trolls, and so different feel compared to a lot of other sword and sorcery. And it is also very tragic. It is just a tragedy, essentially, right? And so you might enjoy this one. This is not my favorite Paul Anderson, but I did enjoy this book. And if you want to read something that came out the same year, I believe, as The Fellowship of the Ring. So, and then we have Clark Ashton Smith. So I have his collection here, which is the easiest thing to get of his, because otherwise he's kind of hard to get a hold of sometimes. and this is the Dark Eidolon and other stories. And the Dark Eidolon is a good sword and sorcery story. Now, some people might not see Clark Ashton Smith as sword and sorcery because Smith is more of an in-between something like Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, and those are the big three of weird tales. And he is, how do I say this? Howard has very lean prose. Lovecraft has kind of, well, he's criticized as being too archaic. Then if Lovecraft is archaic, then Clark Ashton Smith is unreadable. But in reality, he's just got the most insane vocabulary ever. And he is essentially Lovecraft on some very trippy drugs. But he's got similar feels. Conan is very much, I'm going to stab the eldritch creature. Lovecraft's very much, I am doomed. Clark Ashton Smith is a little bit more into the you're doomed area. So you have the tale of the Satampra Zeros, the coming of the White Worm, the Dark Eidolon, some other stories again that are maybe a little close to what sword and sorcery is, maybe not quite there. It depends on who you ask. But I really just highly recommend Clark Ashton Smith in general. And you can find his different settings like Hyperborea, Poseidonis, Zigarf, Averone, and Zothique. The Dark Eidolon being a Zothique story, which is a story that is a supercontinent far in the future. The sun is red, which means it's dying Earth, which gets us to our next, a very worthy successor. I feel like Clark Ashton Smith is Jack Vance, and the Dying Earth stories, probably his most famous stories. These get a little less sword and sorcery as the series goes on. This is 4 novels in here. The first one being The Dying Earth, second one being Knights of the Overworld, and those two are very sword and sorcery. They're also very picaresque. But Vance is very important on the fantasy genre as of today. Vancian magic is what you'll sometimes hear D&D described as, because D&D takes ideas of magic from this book, actually. So I actually like this cover, though it's not very important to the stories, or really at all, but a lot of people don't like it because of that. But yeah, there's like prismatic spray, for example, and Vecna in D&D is just a, switch around Vance and you get Vecna. But Vance is very fun. I like his style a lot. He's not for everyone. A lot of people will like the first novel and maybe not the second and third novel, which have the main character of Kugel, who's very much a rogue, not a good guy. But I very much enjoy his novels, and a very interesting Dying Earth setting, hence why the genre is called Dying Earth, because this novel is so influential and it's good. I think it came out in like 1951 or something like that. So very good stuff. Again, kind of like this, a little more out there, but sword and sorcery, I'd still say. Another good one is, let's see if I forget anything. Yeah, okay, is Lee Brackett's. These are a little kind of cutting it close because these are more Sword and Planet, which is very similar to Sword and Sorcery. It's old school sci-fi, kind of like Barsoom, all right, the John Carter stuff from Edgar Rice Burroughs. Lee Brackett's probably most famous for, I believe, writing the first version of the script of Empire Strikes Back. But she's a really good writer. These are her Eric John Stark books. It's Eric John Stark in the back. And this is the Black Amazon of Mars. But in her Skaith trilogy, which kind of was written later, so these take place in the solar system. The Skaith is further out as, sci-fi evolved. And they didn't want stuff in the solar system anymore, at least not space opera. Whether this is space opera is questionable, I guess, though. But I've really enjoyed the Lee Brackett I've read, and I need to read more Lee Brackett because she's really good. Another one, or another couple, rather, are Roger Zelazny's The Amber Chronicles, or Nine Princes in Amber is book 1. This is, again, another one that's like kind of close to Sword and Sorcery, maybe not quite there. It's also kind of sci-fi at the same time. I don't know. It has modern stuff. It's kind of portal fantasy. You have to read it, and it's really good. It's the best blending of like modern stuff with fantasy that I've ever read, and very much worthwhile. A lot of people, I think, would consider it Sword and Sorcery, at least in part, and it is worth your time regardless. There is a series of his that's less famous, probably not as good, if I were to guess, but it is very strictly Sword and Sorcery. It's called Dilvish the Damned. It is a fix-up novel. I have a copy of it actually back there, and I think there's a more traditional novel called The Changing Land, I believe, which is a sequel to Dilvish the Damned. So you should read Nine Princes in Amber, though, if you haven't. Do yourself a favor. So, and then another one, which is kind of pre-Sword and Sorcery, we consider Robert E. Howard to be the father of Sword and Sorcery, but some people would read the story What is it? The Fortress Unvanquishable, Save for Sacknoth by Lord Dunsany, which is in his The Swords of Welleran and Other Stories anthology or collection, I guess. And this story, yeah, it does have a lot of hallmarks of sword and sorcery. I wasn't actually a huge fan of it when I read it. It's my least favorite thing I've read by Dunsany, even compared to his other stories, his other short stories, I should say. But it is something that's interesting to read. And that would put the timeline back from what we were looking at originally from the 1920s to, I believe, 1908, I believe, is when the Sword of Welleran and Other Stories came out. Might be in the teens there, though, not in the aughts. And that's essentially I had the first three, the second three, and then the other ones. Now, these last ones I haven't really read so much, besides the very last one. I'll mention that when I get there, though. We have Tanith Lee, who is known for a lot of things, I feel like, but I haven't read very much by her. I've read one short story, so I don't feel very comfortable talking much about her. But Tanith Lee is probably worth checking out. Richard L. Tierney, I hear decent things about. Don't hear about him much, though. Latro by Gene Wolfe, I have not read. I'm a huge fan of Gene Wolfe. Most fantasy, when it gets written in the 80s, is probably not going to be considered sword and sorcery, but I have heard it from a pretty reliable source that it is considered sword and sorcery, at least by the source. Another one from that same source is Niftaline by Michael Shea. And yeah, again, I haven't read that yet. That's another book that's hard to get a hold of. I'd like to read, but haven't read that. Though Shea did do a Kugel story actually for the Dying Earth. There's two sequels to The Eyes of the Overworld, and one of them is A Quest for Symbolists, which is written by Shea. And I very much enjoyed that. It's not in that Dying Earth bind-up, though. And then last but not least is Robin Hobb, actually, or Megan Lindholm. I believe her name is actually Margaret Lindholm. But Harpy's Flight, I haven't read it yet, but I did read a short story that is of these two, this duo. It's Key and someone else. I can't remember. Key is really the main character, I believe, but she's got this buddy that follows around. But I read the story Bones for Duloth, I think is what it's called, and Amazons by Jessica Amanda Salmonson. Don't know how to say her name exactly. And this is an anthology with sword and sorcery stories in it. So, and that story is very much sword and sorcery. And so that is actually the first, I believe, professional piece by Robin Hobb, who, of course, more famous for epic fantasy, which, I haven't read much of at all. But if you're interested in more of her earlier stuff, I'm pretty sure you could probably call Harpy's Flight sword and sorcery. But again, I haven't read it yet. But I know the first story of the same characters is sword and sorcery. So anyways, if you have any other recommendations or anything I missed or anything you disagree with, let me know. Anything on this list you would like to try, if you need help finding what you should buy. Again, a lot of these are short stories or shorter novels. I need to make a version of this that is modern, right? A modern sword and sorcery series or books or short stories that you should read. Problem with that is that it would go out of date very quickly because that is just how modern publishing works, obviously. So, and I feel like I haven't read enough yet, which is why it took so long to make this. But anyways, hopefully this list is satisfying for someone. I'm trying to bring sword and sorcery to the denizens of the internet. That's what I've stated, on Twitter. So, see if I'm succeeding or not. Anyways, Liam from Liam's Lyceum. I'll catch you next time.